Okay, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. That's the classic hands-on SAP dev greeting. And yeah, you're all very welcome to this special session, this recorded session that Daniel and I are going to be doing. Well, Daniel's going to do all of the work. Daniel, welcome.
Hello, hi DJ.
And we're going to spend some time showing you folks how to get started building a CAP application. Um, During Devtoberfest, during TechEd, and all the conferences that sort of with a long tail of TechEd up until recently, on more than more than quite a few occasions, folks came up to me and said, how do I get started with CAP? And so this is a perfect opportunity because Daniel's also had similar requests. So we thought we'd get together and do a 2025-2026, i.e. modern day approach to starting and building a CAP application, bearing in mind best practices where appropriate and so on. So Daniel, I'm going to hand over to you now to maybe give us a further bit of the introduction, and then you can start sharing your screen and we'll dive into it.
All right, perfect. Thank you, DJ. Yeah, I'm Daniel from the enablement team working in the CAP unit. And yeah, like DJ said, we get a lot of those requests on how to get started, what's the best way, and also what are the best practices, right? When I want to get started. So let's have a look at that. And first of all, let's maybe look at this diagram because, I was thinking about when you want to get started, what are the typical ways you would do that, right? And
Yeah.
what we want to look at today first is getting started from scratch. So really, we take an empty folder, nothing in it, and we start developing our CAP application there. It's the first option. There is a nice little shortcut that, takes away a lot of that work that we would usually have starting ourselves. So the way we are starting now initially, well, we'll scratch that and do it a bit differently later on. Then there's the possibility of, well, the whole, vibe coding story. You can, for example, go to Business Application Studio and ask Joule to create a project for you, right? And it will create you a data model and service definitions and so on as well, and give you a starting application that you can then use and develop on top of that. Or, of course, cloning an existing project is also a very good option. And actually, we have some nice sample applications, S-Flight or X-Travel, as it's called now, incident management and so on. That can also be a good starting point sometimes to have a look at those and play around with those as well.
Yeah,
Um,
and already, talking about the sample applications, they are a great source of best practices. As I would also argue, I hope you agree, Daniel, that the CDS command line tool, for example, CDS init, is one of the CDS command line tool commands init, as well as CDS add sample, for example, and I'm hoping we can show that using the CDS command line tool will also just by default get you using best practices and the best practice approaches for building this stuff.
Absolutely. And there's so much in it, right? Like when we just go here, we see there's we will only scratch the surface of this today, with using one or two of these samples, or commands, sorry, and then take it from there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If in doubt, use the CDS command line tool and then see where you are.
perfect. Yeah, and then I mean with that we have like a basic application, and then there's the typical kind of development tasks, and we will look at a couple of those today as well, like adding a domain model, which is the most important part of our application. I think we can agree on that, right?
Yep.
And then our service definition, which is basically exposing this domain model to the outside world. We are going to be adding some test data. And from there on, it can really differ, depending on what your application is like. You might be adding a user interface with your elements, for example. You might be adding plugins, which allow you, like our plugins are a very interesting thing as well. They allow you to connect to BTP services or introduce additional functionality to your application without you having to do much coding, right? Making it
Yeah.
very, very simple to do those things.
And I think also just again riffing on the same topic we had just a minute ago. If in doubt, use a CDS command line tool. If in doubt, oh yeah, I wonder if there's a plugin for this because then you don't have to write any code. And also, if in doubt, looking at this development tasks box, going from sort of the most important and the primary activity, adding domain model. If in doubt, try and express what you want, your intent, declaratively, and only as almost like a last resort, write some code.
Exactly. And yeah, I think we will look at this today as well, right? We will
Yeah,
write some code just to throw it away later. But well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I did forget.
it's too exciting.
All right.
Okay, so we're going to
So
go from scratch first, aren't we?
exactly. So if we wanted to get started from scratch and no need to remember these commands and what I'm doing here because we're gonna go the much easier, simpler way. But I think it really helps to understand what's actually happening, right? So, um, if we start a CAP project, what we usually have in our project is this kind of package JSON file, which just kind of tells us that at the end it will be, a node application. And the basic dependencies that we will have is to the CDS framework, right? Because we want to build a CAP application. Um, so that is that.
Yep.
And we'll just add that to our package, and you see it just adds it here as a dependency. And what we also want to have for local development is we want to add the database that we're using here. And for local development, so usually when we deploy the application later on, we use maybe something like a HANA database. But here for local development, we want to keep it very simple and use an SQLite database, and it just allows us to always run this application very quickly locally on a local in-memory database.
Yes, I mean, it's also worth pointing out that simple doesn't necessarily mean restricted or cut down. So pretty much all the features that we use at the SQL level, CQL level, at the domain modeling level, the service level, the querying level, are all supported in SQLite just as they might be in other databases as well. And that's due to the driver, as it were, or the database layer that we've just installed.
Exactly. And I don't know if you noticed when I created a schema CDS, it was already giving me a little cup logo here on the right-hand side. Um,
Actually, that's a prompt. Is it worth just very briefly, Daniel, mentioning, obviously you're using VS Code, but
yes,
you've also got the CDS extension, right?
yes, exactly. There's a few things we want to install before we start. I think maybe we can link that in the documentation,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Um, Okay, so we have our basic dependencies. I should have probably added this CapJS SQLite in the development dependencies, but it's a small thing, right?
Yeah.
And I executed a command called CDS watch, and this is how we usually start the application locally, right? For development here.
Mhm.
Um, and it tells me no models found because the project is still empty, right? So we have our basic structure. And let's very, very simply here add a file called the schema CDS. And you see now the server has restarted it and it's picking up that file. So it's actually looking for this file in different directories. Maybe I jumped a bit too far. It's still there.
There we go. Yeah, those are the so-called CDS roots.
Exactly, the CDS roots, yeah. So it's looking for files in any of these directories, database, service, and app, or for a file called schema or services.cds. And since we created it, it's just using that now.
And actually, we'll come across the directories, DB app and serve, in the next approach to starting, right?
Okay, and now we can actually start, writing our
Domain.
application. And first we will start very, very simply here. And we can say, okay, I want to have an entity books. Okay, here it's now database books. And what should it have? So let's just take whatever is created here. So We get the entity database books. It has an ID, title, author, stock, and price. I think we can work with that. And
I think we can work with that. And in fact, just a reminder to those watching, we're on the very first box in that long, narrow box in the diagram, in the getting started diagram. Lines 1 to 7 is essentially the domain model, right?
exactly, yeah. So at the start, we keep it very simple. Everything is in one file. This is basically our domain model, and this is our service definition here,
Yeah,
right? So everything in one file, very, very simple. Not a best practice yet, but we will like stretch it out later and take it apart into different files, and then
exactly.
we're following more of those best practices.
But it's nice to be able to see everything at once just for this initial go.
Exactly. Okay, so we have our books entity defined, and we have basically a service defined, which means we're defining that this database books, again, maybe not the best naming here, is exposed as entity books in a superbooks service. And
Superbooks, I like that.
superbooks. And if I actually, the server has started, when I click on that, I already get an OData for Superbooks. So, and you see that there is basically my definition of that books entity already. And if I go into the metadata, you can see that I have an entity books, and it has exactly those properties that we have defined before, right?
Exactly, and it's also worth maybe just pointing out what's happened here. The CDS the CAP server that's running because you started it with CDS Watch has noticed these changes. It's compiled the domain model. It's also compiled a definition for the service. It's exposing that service by default as OData, OData v4, of course, and making the entity there in line 10, that projection called books, available as an entity set, right?
Exactly, yeah. And if you wanted to, there's this nice little preview functionality here as well. And we could even have a look at what's happening, right? So we can, for example, go here, preview as SQL, and you can see what's actually happening on our SQLite database, right? So it created a table, books. It created a view, our Superbooks service books. Um, as a select from the database, and that is then our definition for the services, right?
Yes, exactly. So at this point, we're looking sort of downwards to the database layer. And then in the EDMX on the browser, we're sort of looking upwards to the interface, the API, the OData service that has been exposed to be consumed by, whoever or whatever.
Exactly. All right. So right now, um, okay, let's maybe first do one thing. What I want to do is first to really show this application fully, right? We have another little CDS command. So we can use the CDS add data and add 10 records to our books entity here. So what happened now? It created a CSV file that actually has a couple of sample data, test data that we can use for our application. And if I do the CDS watch or CDSW as a shortcut again, um, and go back into my application, when I click on the books now, you will see that there's actually all these books created and available, so I can actually test the application already with some data here. Is it test or sample data?
Well, that's a really interesting thing. This is initial data. There are two types of data that we can supply as JSON or as CSV, as was done here, sort of by default. One is initial data, which we've just generated, but there's also sample data as well, which is sort of more throwaway. So think of initial data as what you might want to actually eventually deploy to production, maybe some configuration tables or whatever, and sample data as, this is also just as valid as sample data.
Exactly. Um, all right, so you can see what we also can generate here very easily is just this Fiori preview, where you can also now see this data that we have displayed well nicely on a UI. Maybe we can still do some improvements to that by generating a full-blown Fiori application on top. But you see that we very, very quickly get to an application that allows us to create, read, update, and delete data, right, without writing a single line of code. Um, yeah,
Yeah, it's still, I mean, even to this day, it still blows my mind how quickly we've gone from literally nothing in the directory to a fully CRUD working OData service and Fiori front end, Fiori Elements front end in the space of, a few minutes, as opposed to, what I used to do on ABAP stacks with, Segwit and so on, that you used to measure it in hours or days.
exactly. And it's only, you see here, 11 lines of code with some empty lines, right? So, um,
And no moving parts, all declarative.
yeah. All
And
right. So what we've done so far is we took the our books entity from the database and we just exposed it one to one to the outside world, right? And we don't always want to do that, right? So how do we go about this? And actually, what I can do here is I can specify the elements that I want to be exposed. I need the ID because it's a key field. But if I, for example, don't want to show, well, that's not really a field I don't want to show. Wait, maybe I
maybe
don't
the
want to show
stock, yeah.
stuff.
We don't want to show the stock.
Yeah,
And also maybe we want to expose that, particular element with a different name.
let's do that. Let's take the author as the writer, for example, right?
Perfect.
And if I go back to my user interface, um, well, let's just show it here directly. Um, you see the author is now a writer and we haven't exposed the stock. And I think that's a really important concept as well, right? So what we want to do sometimes is we don't want to just take the domain model and expose it one to one because
No.
there might be technical fields the user don't want to see, or even we want to maybe restructure the data. If our author comes from a different entity in a more complex data model, maybe we only need the author.name and
Yeah,
want to show that as the writer, right? So
exactly.
we can do some really nice things there, where a lot of times what we see is projects just doing this one-to-one projection of everything they have in the database. So then we don't need this layer, right? We can just auto-generate it for you. We wouldn't need that, but this is really powerful because you can do quite a few things here as well.
And already, even just looking at the contents of this file, we're seeing many best practice examples. So naming conventions, so entity names should be plural and capitalized. Element names, title, author, stock, should be lowercased and singular. For example, the structure should be also as flat and as simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't over-engineer it. Plus, as you just said, Daniel, services are cheap. They're very easy to define. So we could define a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth different service for different consumption scenarios, which is a best practice rather than, as you say, a bad practice, which is to do a one-to-one pass-through mapping, right?
Yeah, exactly. I can define multiple services here, and then we could talk about these use case oriented services, right? So that could be a catalog service for people just browsing the books, right? And there could be an admin service for the people who put new books into our into our library here, for example, right?
And what we haven't talked about, of course, yet is authentication and authorization. And that, once we start to think, okay, well, we need this group of people to be able to access this, but this group of people to access that, having more services that are more use case driven makes that a lot more possible.
Yeah, if only there was a way to show this, right? I think we're ready to jump to our CDS init and add sample part, right?
I think that would be really cool. Yeah. Yeah, I guess we're gonna leave the from scratch, but I think this also shows that, there's nothing magic. Well, there's lots magic in CAP, but in terms of starting a project, there's no incantations that you have to remember. It's just a regular Node.js project.
Yeah, okay. So I've just thrown away everything we did so far and
Yep.
let's start again. But this time we start with CDS init.
So instead of npm init, we're using CDS init.
Yeah. And you see a whole lot of things have appeared here. So when you remember earlier when we were doing CDS Watch, right? So it looked for files in three directories, and surprisingly, those three directories are here. So we can see, database is usually where our database schema goes, service, our service definition. So we wouldn't do this in one file. And the application can go into the app folder.
Yes, that's if we had any assets, static asset, HTML5 style assets for a UI that we wanted the CAP server to serve for us as well. If we put them in there, it will do that.
Exactly. But as you saw with our one file approach, it's really just a suggestion to do it this way and helping you to structure the project, but it's not a technical requirement per se. Yeah.
No,
All
no.
right. Um, yeah, so we have our typical files here. You see a lot of it looks similar to what we had before. There's a couple of additional things, but I don't think we need to worry about it now.
No.
And we'll jump to another command here, which is the CDS add sample. And what this will do is it will fill our application with a kind of sample project that we have. And you see some things appear in the service and the database folder.
Yeah, so basically those folders were empty just before you did CDS add sample, and now they've been populated with these files that we're looking at now.
Exactly. And we even have like two sample applications for the front end, the admin application and the browse. So that's what we
Yep.
were just pointing to already, right? And we have a bit of a more sophisticated data model here. Let's
Right.
have a look at that. Um, You can see here that we still have our entity books. They still have a couple of the fields we saw before, like for example the title, right?
Yep.
What has changed in the title is it's a localized string, so we can basically, when there's internationalization, when I look at those books in German, maybe I get the German title, you get the hopefully British English, right, and not
I
American.
get the Brexit title.
Exactly. Um, and then we also say that the title is mandatory. So this is already an information that basically provides that when you create a new book, it has to have a title, right? Because what is a book without a title?
And also, just for those folks watching, thinking, okay, well, do I have to implement the actual checking to see whether there is a title? No, this actually is not only declarative, it also causes a check to happen in the out of the box built-in CRUD handling.
Exactly. Mhm. And then we have um, a few more fields that are, let's say, simple fields here. You see the stock, the price, and well, currency is actually a type, right? That comes here from the sub-CDS common. Um, Okay, so I think the simple types we don't have to talk about here, but right, for example, the currency, you see it
Hmm.
comes from CDS Common, and if I click into that, you see that it comes from SAP Common Currency. So there's a couple of like predefined types. You see the currency managed in SAP that we use from the Common package here. And for example, what this managed aspect brings us that we have on the top here is it brings us four fields created at, created by, modified at, modified by, that basically just, help with an entity. So whenever we create something, we can see the user that has created it, and $now is the timestamp at the time that it was created, and modified by and modified at with the same concept, right? Just instead of on insert, it's on update.
I think where we are right now, looking at the import or the use of these things like currency managed and SAP from that particular module there, or it could be from another file, one of your files or whatever. That is a super best practice, i.e., don't reinvent the wheel for things that you and every other project needs because they're right there for you.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, one aspect we see usually used or very commonly used, let's say, is the CUID aspect
UID,
as
yeah.
well, right? That gives you basically this ID field as a UUID, And it has the advantage of here with those integers, you have to manually kind of deal with those, which is a bit cumbersome. And CUID is auto-generated for you, and you don't have to worry about it.
Yep.
Um,
No more number ranges.
exactly. Manually counting up numbers is not fun, right? Um, all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think it's probably also worth looking at or just talking about the associations because you did mention those before. You know, if for a more complex, more realistic scenario, this is an example of where we have two entities related to each other in various ways.
Exactly. So we have the author, which you remember probably previously, I think it was just a string.
Just a string, yeah.
Um, but obviously, it makes more sense in a domain model to have the author here as a separate entity. And you see here, here's an entity authors, and we have now a couple of more details about the author, right? The name, the date of birth, place of birth, um, and actually the books that an author has written. So you see from the books, there's basically an association to the authors. Um, and it's again mandatory. So a book has to have an author, and that basically links us in our data model to the authors, and then from the authors we can actually see what books were written by a specific author by following that association. But it's an association to many in that case, or
Exactly. Yeah.
on the books to wherever the book's author is myself here, right? So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's this. We're diving into modeling and the CDL, the language itself that we're looking at. There are lots of resources which we'll also link to for more about this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a super simple way of modeling.
Yeah. And then we have another one, genre. And we have an association to genre, and genre is an interesting thing on a book. So book has one genre, but what is this? So we have a genre can have basically subgenres, right? And a parent genre. And this is kind of like well, you see a hierarchy that is created by this. And we have another keyword here, composition. So what is a composition?
Exactly. It's a contained in relationship.
hmm So basically, what it leads to practically, right? When in our application, if we delete our parent or our not our parent, our genre here, then all the children of that will be deleted as well, right? So that's the contained in relationship.
Yeah, the classic example from ERP is a document, a purchase order, for example. You have the header, which is the parent, and then you have the items, which are the children. And of course, the children, the items can't exist outside of the context of the document that they live in.
Yeah. All right. I think one thing we haven't mentioned yet here is the namespace. So everything that is in this namespace sub Kapaya Bookshop, so everything under this basically lives in that namespace, right? So that just
It's just
keeps
a,
it
it's just a
around.
scope prefix, isn't it?
Mhm.
And you don't need namespaces, but when you are building real projects with larger models, you will need namespaces to help you manage the components.
Yes. Okay, should we jump to the service definition?
I think so, yes.
Perfect. Then you see here actually we have not one CDS file, but two. So again, everything that's under the SRV folder will be picked up. So we will have those two files, two services here.
The
The
two
admin
CDS
service,
files, yeah.
exactly. We have the admin service and we have a catalog service. So let's look at the admin service first. And what we already mentioned is this kind of role concept that CAP has, right? So we say the admin service requires the role admin, which means everything under it will require, you have to have this admin role. So not everyone can access this admin service because here we have the full scope of being able to create, read, update, and delete books and authors.
And for those folks thinking, okay, that's really cool, but how would I even test that locally? One of the best practices is to develop locally in CAP, one of the CAP best practices, and one of the many affordances for developers in that context is to mock everything. So already we've seen mocking data with the CDS add data. We can also mock authentication. And in fact, by default, that's the mode, the authentication or the auth mode that is run when you start the server with CDS Watch, right? Well, we might see that again from the output, the log output, but we can very easily try these different roles out to, even on Daniel's laptop right now without any connection to any cloud authentication service.
Exactly. Yeah, such an important concept to stay local, right? In your development and be able to test everything there. Absolutely. Yeah. I think what we haven't talked about it as well as this first line. You see that basically, I mean, we want to, if you remember our previous approach where we only had one file, we were basically saying that, the database books, or books is a projection on database books. Here we want to refer to some what is already defined in our database schema or our domain model. And we basically just use that namespace, it even says namespace up here, and give it an alias, and then by that call it here, right? So this
Yeah.
is just how we find the things from our domain model, and same as before, just that we're referring to them from another file, and this namespace concept helps us to do that really easily as well.
That's right, and the using from is a very important mechanism when we start to build real projects because we do want to separate out different concerns, different parts of the modeling that we have that we end up with into separate files, into separate directories, maybe even import from separate projects. And so this using concept, and as well as the alias concept and the scopes here, sap.capire, for example, .bookshop, these are all very important.
Exactly, yeah. And let's have a quick look at the catalog service as well. It's a bit more complicated, but let's see what happens here. Again, you see the same using from statement that we had before because, well, we're referring to the same domain model, right?
Yep.
Now we have a catalog service, and what we have defined here is a read-only list of books, right? So I can only, I'm not allowed to change books anymore. And this is a projection on books. But where is this books defined? Let's have a look. Just under it. So our books is a projection on my books, our domain books. And it takes all the fields. So this is the star, right? We take all the fields that are there directly, not on the associations. But we don't only want to show the books entity itself, but we also want to show the author.name. So we're basically following this association to the author, taking the author.name, pulling that in, and we say we want to have the author.name as author
I mean,
directly shown.
this inline 80, the author.name looks so innocent and so simple, which it is, but it's an incredibly powerful mechanism, which in the CAP world is called a path expression. So when you see references to the phrase path expression, here's a great example of that. All we as domain modelers and service definers need to do is to define a dotted path to the target that we want to expose, for example, and everything else is taken care of for us.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's so simple, but under the hood, complex things happen, right?
Just like a swan.
Yes. Um, and okay, what we can also say is we have some technical fields, right? Created by, modified by. We don't want to show that to our catalog service users, right? They shouldn't see those technical fields. Um,
Exactly. And if folks remember a few minutes ago, they came from the managed aspect, which I think we use to decorate the entity.
exactly. Yeah. And okay. You see here, we don't have any requires, right? We don't. So basically, for just having a look at the books, we don't need to authenticate or do anything like that. But the we have one action that we have here, which is submitting an order, which requires you to be an authenticated user, right? And if you think about the usual kind of bookshop, online bookshop, you would have the same thing, right? You can have a look at all the books that are there, but once you want to buy a book, um, you actually need to be authenticated, right? So we have the and you see here another construct is basically this action. So an action is just something we can call, for example, from the user interface. And then we say, okay, we want to have a certain book in a certain quantity. And then something happens, it is action implementation. And at the end, we return the stock that is still left of this book as an integer. So another concept, I don't think we have time to go into it in detail today, right?
No, maybe asynchronous messaging as a follow-up.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so much to dive in. Um,
Yeah.
and also there's an event in this application, the ordered book. So basically, once someone does the submit order action, we trigger an event that the book was ordered, and then someone can react to that event. It could either be our application itself, just following up on something. It could even be if you go into the BTP later on, it could even translate into cloud events, right?
Exactly. And while we're on this page here, just again for folks thinking, so authenticated user is an example of what we call a pseudo role, as opposed to in the previous admin service CDS file, where I think we saw requires admin. That is a regular role. So you can define roles, of course, and then those get translated to roles and role collections in whatever authorization mechanism you're using in the cloud. But there are certain built-in roles, such as authenticated user, which means you need to have authenticated, but there's no specific role required here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also for those thinking, what the heck is going on with those double colons there on line 26? The name of the property there, the first argument there, book, is defined by the element ID of the book's entity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting point. It looks probably a bit confusing when you see that for the first time, right?
Quite often you would probably see no white space before or after the second colon. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should just have a quick look at the application, right, and see what we're dealing with here. So
Yeah.
I think we have explained what's happening. So if we go here, we basically have now two applications, right? The browse books and the manage books application. You see, if I go into browse books, I just get the list of books. Again, there's some data for me here that we have defined in the database folder. Um, that we can use. And we can see here when we go into a book, you get the book title, the book description, some details, whatever we decided to show on the UI.
Yep. And all
Here,
this data is just like just in CSV files, just like before.
exactly, yeah. I think they are right, are they? We can
If
look at it.
Yeah, they should be. Let's have a look. Yeah, DB data books. There we go.
Perfect. You see where it's coming from. Um, right. And what you can see here is there's no create button, right? We cannot create any books. We're just browsing books.
And that, again, for those who are wondering how the heck that is being brought about, that is through the annotations in the EDMX, which come from the annotations in our model. And of course, Fiori Elements is annotation driven, and the annotations in EDMX are exactly where it's looking for.
Exactly, yeah. Mhm.
So now we're thinking, what's going on here?
Strange, right? Because I clicked on manage books and all of a sudden I have to sign in.
Exactly, and
Uh,
this is that pseudo role, requires authenticated user.
so I'm gonna pretend I'm Alice and log in as Alice. So we have a couple of, let's say, predefined test users, and there's Alice that has the admin role. Um, So we can just use that to test that. If we were to define different roles, then we can just also put test user configuration there
Yep.
that is then used for the local testing only.
Yep. Yeah, there's a number of users defined, but out of the box that are used in this mock auth strategy, the authentication strategy, which is the one run by default. Alice, Bob, well, all lots of users with different roles, so you can have, and also different tenant information if you want to build a multi-tenant application. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yes, exactly. I think what we wanted to show here, right, is now I mean, we still have the books, right? But you can see there's a bit more details that we show here. Because it's the admin service, for example, the translations, you can see the different translations, and we can see more fields, for example, those created by and changed by fields that we were leaving out. Um, and we now have the power to create a new book. And you see even that the fields that were mandatory, like the title and the author, they have this little red asterisk here, so we know they're actually needed. And if we try to create a book, there's it tells us, that there's something missing and marks the fields red for us. So there's a lot of magic happening behind the scene just from the way we have defined our model. Um,
For example, also the value that the author field is a value help rather than a plain input box because, of course, it's an association.
And it brings up only the authors that were already created. Isn't that great?
Wonderful.
Um,
I don't know what else he wrote. I know he wrote The Raven. The Raven 2. Put The Raven 2 in. He wrote a follow-up.
I don't think that exists. Anyways, it exists now, right?
It does now.
Perfect. Yeah, the Raven 2. Who would have known?
Who would have known? Certainly
Um,
a very rare book.
all right. I think that, shows the application that comes out of it. What else did we want to show here? What are those JavaScript files? So,
Well, yeah, we almost want to sort of show those by not showing those because, what are they for? Everything that we've done so far, or more or less everything we've done so far, has been handled for us by the CAP Node.js server runtime. However, there are certain things that we as developers have to take care of. For example, I think what Daniel was pointing to on line 26. Line 26 of the admins or the cat service. Yeah, there.
oh, that's always line 26. Ah, submit order. I see where you're going. Okay, catalog service. So basically, if we have like catalog minus service.cds, right? And we just create a JavaScript file with the same name, the magic happens that those are connected to each other, and whatever is written in this implementation file here basically is linked to the service that is in the service file, right?
Yeah.
We can
This is
override that, but this is the standard way.
Yeah, and another feature. Maybe it's not a best practice, but it's a best practice to embrace this feature, which is convention over configuration. We've already seen, for example, if you put the right put CSV files with the right name in the right place, they'll be picked up and used and deployed to the database before as the CAP server starts up. If you put the model files, the CDS files, in the known places, in the roots, in the DB directory, serve directory, and so on, they'll get picked up automatically. And also, if you name your implementation files, your JavaScript files, the same as the corresponding CDS files, they will be used automatically for implementation details.
Mhm. All right, so what do we have here? What we have here is we basically register some custom handlers, right? And what those custom handlers do is we can add certain, business logic to our application, certain things that we need in addition to the generic CRUD handlers. And let's look at a couple of samples here, right? So
Yeah.
add some discount for overstock books. What does this do? After um, a book in our list of books is loaded, right? So this only happens on the list of books that we had here.
And that's a projection. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, we see if the book.stock is larger than 111, And if that is the case, we take the book title and we just add something at the end, a string that says 11% discount, right? So we give a discount to overstocked books, let's call it.
Exactly. So it's probably worth also pointing out at this stage, there are three main phases of any request handling: the before, the on, and the after. And the before and the after are sort of add-ons, almost like, sort of buffers either side that you can use to jump on and enhance the standard CRUD handling if you want to. But if you want to override or supply the basic handling for something that isn't handled, as in this case here, you can use the on phase.
Exactly. Yeah. And yeah, also a caution, right, to using the on phase, because if you just use the on phase without the um
Calling next.
yeah, without the next, then you're basically overriding the standard CRUD functionality, right? And you usually don't want to do that. So some caution with that. But here, because this is an action, right, a submit order. So let's see what happens here. We get in the parameters, right, that were provided to the action, the book ID and the quantity. Um, and then we basically take that and we go to our database, right, and we throw a select statement at it. We await it, so it's being executed straight away, and we wait for the result, um, where we select one books, and we basically just give it a book's ID. So that should give us only one book back, anyways, right? There should be only one book with a certain ID, and then get back the stock of that book, right?
Yep.
And basically, what we want to do is, yeah, we want to see, okay, the book should exist, right? That you submit an order for. The quantity should be more than one. Otherwise, I cannot submit an order for a book. And if I try to order more than one book, right, if my quantity is larger than the stock, then also an error should be returned.
Yeah. That's still an incredibly small amount of code for that much functionality.
Exactly, yeah. And then once all of this is done, we want to update the book. Again, we find it with its ID and by reducing the stock by the quantity.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking, in terms of best practices, I'm just thinking, maybe I'll submit a pull request for lines 15 and 16. Maybe those lets should be consts.
Oh, they don't change, do they?
No.
All right. And well, maybe let's look at the last one here as well. So this after we submit an order, right? We emit an event, the ordered book event, and then somebody can deal with that.
Somebody can deal with that. Throw your hands up in the air, let go, send that off. And again, talking of best practices and staying local from a development perspective, we've talked about mocking data. We've talked about mocking authentication, the mocked authentication strategy. But also, we can mock real asynchronous messaging. So instead of having to connect to a real, event hub instance, for example, for asynchronous messaging or something else, there's file-based messaging which is built in that we can use again to test, build and test locally.
Yeah. All right. So I think it's time to maybe try and write our own custom handler. What do you think?
I think that would be cool.
So one thing in this application here is if I go and I create a book, right? Um, let's just give it something here. And here. And I set the stock to -12. Does that make sense? Does not make sense to have a book with a stock of -12, does it? So I think what we should do, and you see, it just saved the book and it went through. It is there
Yeah,
now, and it has a stock of -12.
yeah.
So I think what we should do is maybe, don't allow that.
We're getting into Fahrenheit 451 territory. Now there's a literature reference. Anybody gets that?
Yeah. So what is the right thing to do here? So we have to create another custom handler, right? So when do we want to do this? I think it needs to be a before, right?
Well, if we want to catch it and say, no, that's not allowed, then of course we've either got to do it on their on handler, but it's a lot easier and we have to do a lot less work if we use the before handler, right?
Yeah. But before which event, I don't think I'm entirely sure yet which event I need here. So what we can do here is maybe just use the star for now, and that will catch all of them.
Yeah. So the signature pattern here is we have as the first argument we'll have the event, and that's a very generic term. Event, request, event. They're the same thing. Synchronous, asynchronous. So this could be create, read, update, delete, or any sort of custom event. So we're catching everything, and then the books is the topic or the subject of the event, right?
Exactly. And you see, Copilot is already smarter than me. So it once I told it I want to do something before the books are created, it picked up that there's something around the stock here. Um, so does that already match what we want to do?
Yeah, the rec.data.stock. So we're accessing this the value of the stock field that's coming in the request from the data, which is an object structure from the payload of the request. Um, I think that looks okay. Let's try it.
All right, let's do that.
Did you save that by the way? Because I didn't see the restart in the CDS watch.
Ah, it's a very common, another best practice, no? Save your files.
Save you, but yes, although I also don't like autosave, so that would have happened to me as well.
So, I mean, we can just go into an existing book, right?
Yeah, so when you did ASD, you did a
Oh,
create, but we're now going to do a an update, I guess.
exactly. So we go into a book, we go into the edit mode, and we set the stock to -12, and it saved. What happened? Did we implement this custom handler in the catalog service?
Ah, we want the admin service, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. So what we did is we used the catalog service, right? But in the catalog service, we're not changing any books. We're doing that in our admin service.
Yes.
What did I do now? Book is books is not defined.
It needs to be inside of the closing bracket before line 17.
Perfect.
Before line 16, in fact.
Yeah, this right. All right. Um, let's try that again. Ah,
Excellent.
and we see the stock cannot be negative. Error message. Okay, it doesn't really show me where this error is happening, right? It doesn't point me to the field, which is not ideal. I could fix that in the custom code. Um, I could write here a little log message that shows me what event I'm in, right? But
Mhm. I mean,
I,
this all seems very reasonable as something that we as developers would need to do.
yeah, it definitely is. Yeah. I guess I wanted to happen before the create event, right? I wanted to happen before the update event. I maybe
Yeah,
want to see if the stock is already there in the request, or if not, maybe.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is the simplest thing that
Um,
could possibly work, the code we're looking at right now, but, you know, it's more involved in reality.
exactly. So yeah, little sample, right, of a custom handler. But what is the best thing about this custom handler?
We can get rid of it.
Can you think of it? Exactly. So let's throw it away. Because we have something that makes this even easier. And let's jump to our documentation for a second and have a look at the at assert. Yeah.
Yes,
So we can do certain asserts, and there's one here that seems particularly interesting, which is called assert range.
exactly. And if folks have not already figured out, anything starting with an at sign is an annotation, right? So this is
Oh yeah.
an annotation.
Oh, that's a super important concept. Yeah. Um, all right. So what you can see here is we have a, entity foo with an element bar, and the bar element here is an integer, and we assert that the range is between 0 and 3, right? Um, So we could just use something like this. Our stock of a book should also be between 0 and, well, it can be higher than 3, right? And we don't want to limit it. So let's have a look at the open intervals.
Yeah.
And we see that we can have something like infinity um, with the underscore signs, right?
Infinity and beyond.
Infinity and beyond. So let's take that. Where do we want to do that? Do we
Well,
want
we certainly don't want to do it in our code. We want to do it in our declarative model
exactly? So
because
can
that
we,
is probably the ultimate best practice, right?
yeah, I mean, you could maybe have an assert that you only want to have on one of your services, like if it's only relevant there.
Ah, yes, yes. Sorry, what I meant was in our CDS files, not in our JavaScript files.
Well, that's for certain. Yeah. Exactly. But we could still decide whether we want to put this on a service level, right? And it's only
Yep,
applied to the service level, or if we want to add this on our domain directly. And you see, for example, the mandatory annotations here, they are on the domain directly because they make sense there. But there could be things like, for example, our Fiori annotations, right? We have them here in the app
yep,
folder, and we don't necessarily want them on all our database entities because maybe we want to have a service that is, not for end users, but it's more thought for a technical user, like an API or something calling that. Um, and then maybe we don't want to have certain annotations. So we really have a control here. If we define something on a database level, it kind of, how do you say, bubbles up, right, to the
yep.
service level, um, but not the other way around.
Exactly, exactly.
So let's go to this doc and we can add it here, right? Don't need this here. So basically what we're saying, the stock should be an integer and we assert the range to be between 0 and infinity, right? Did I do something wrong here? I think. Um, let's see if that works. Manage books, edit, and again we do a -12. And you see, enter value between 0 and
Less than infinity.
less
Less
than
than.
infinity.
I think that's is that the plus infinity or the minus infinity or something? Anyway, yeah,
I suppose so, yeah. I mean, you see what is nicer now is that we have the stock here as an actual, like we can actually see where the error is coming from. It's pointing us to it. We can even click here and it's pointing us to it.
yeah,
I
that's
don't really
beautiful.
like this error message. So can we do something about that?
I wonder.
Well, I wouldn't know, but maybe we can look at the documentation and I see something here, custom error messages. Let's see what
Yeah,
that.
there we go. There we go. Yeah, we can. And
And
by
yeah,
the way, I mean, maybe we won't do this now, but if we did want to add that, I think there's another best practice which is all about separation of concerns. And while for simplicity's sake, we've added the assertion and the assert range message here at the schema level, let's say at the data model level, we might want to have added it at the service level. So we might want to have put it in the admin service.cds file. But actually, it might be that we want to create a new separate CDS file just for these style sorts of annotations. Keep things separate. And it makes things easier to maintain, and so on.
yeah, I'm just realizing now, right? This is starting to become more difficult to read.
Exact already. Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, what I can do here, like you said, I would just create another CDS file and call it maybe um, yeah, asserts or validations or something like this,
Yeah.
validations.cds, and then put all of these things in there, right? And
Yes, and
uh,
then you would use the annotate keyword to sort of start out that sort of assertion of.
exactly. All right, so let's see if that worked. Oops. And did I save this time?
I can't remember.
I did, yeah. Perfect. So- Ah, that's a better error message.
That's much better. You should have a new job in writing error messages. That's you're the king.
Perfect. Yeah, you saw earlier it was an internationalized
Yep,
error
that'll do.
message.
Yep.
Whereas now we just hard coded the text here. So obviously what we had previously would be more of the best practices if you want to deliver your application in more than one language.
Yep.
But this is just the most simple way of demonstrating it here, right?
And I love the. In fact, have you still got the help documentation, the CapI page open where you got that from?
Here.
Yeah, I love the fact that actually it uses exactly the same syntax for those UI5 developers. That looks perfectly normal. So you have a named model called I18N, and then you have the actual component from that model separated by a greater than sign, person age. It's beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nothing new to learn.
Nothing new to learn. So where can we go from here? I think we've basically shown the basic features of a CAP application, right? I think what we would be doing next is maybe look at a couple of these plugins that we have here,
Hmm.
because as I said, those are very easy way of adding some functionality. So if you wanted to, for example, maybe we work with attachments and on the BTP want to use something like the object store service for that to store some attachments that belong to our books, right? For
Yes.
example, we could use something like that. There's, for example, something like change tracking where we can keep track of changes to our data and define where we want to use that, and really many more. So there's, you see, like already a long list of plugins that still keeps growing.
It does keep growing, but also maybe I don't know what you think, Daniel, but maybe also the following is also a best practice, which is let's say you're working in an organization and you're building CAP applications, plural, and you have a certain feature that you want all of your applications to benefit from. One way of doing that is by writing that feature as a module and in the form of a plugin. So you can build your own plugins. You don't have to wait for SAP or a third party to create a plugin for you. It's very easy to create your own plugin. So that is a really nice way of having modular, reusable mechanisms that then don't sort of become part of application A and application B and application C to be maintained individually and multiple times. Write your own plugin.
Exactly, and it's again, it's very simple, right? You see here the CDS plugin technique. So you basically just create an empty project with a CDS plugin, and then using it is very simple, and it's as simple as using one of the predefined plugins, right? It's exactly the same concept, the same mechanism. So the same way we develop our plugins and provide them to you is the same way you can develop and provide your own plugins. So
There's some really nice documentation out there about writing your own plugins. I think actually it's from you, Daniel, isn't it?
I wrote something there. That's true. Perfect. Yeah.
Awesome. So do we want to do anything else here?
I think that's, I think we got
We're coming
started,
up to
right?
about an hour, so I think that's probably enough for now, right?
All right. Yeah. Then let's wrap it up here.
Okay, so maybe we can go back to VS Code and have a quick look and a quick summary. Um, what we've looked at from the diagram that Daniel showed right at the very start is obviously we used the npm init minus y and started really from, a Node.js project scratch. But actually using CDS, the CDS command line tool, we use CDS init, we've used CDS add sample, we've used CDS add data, and so on. And of course CDS watch. So using the CDS command line tool is a super best practice. We've developed everything locally, i.e. we're using initial data, we're mocking initial data via CSV files. We're mocking authentication and we're using real authentication annotations from an authorization perspective, roles required, but also from an authentication perspective, right?
Mhm.
We could, if we wanted to extend that event story and mock eventing through file-based messaging. We could also import and use remote services and mock those remote services. So basically, the keyword here is develop locally and use mocking and embrace everything. And maybe most importantly of all, which is almost like something that's unsaid, declarative first. If you can declare it, define it using the conceptual definition language, CDL, which is what we write in our CDS files, do it there. Use the power of the annotations, use the power of the separate domain model concept and one or more multiple services as layers on top. And if you follow those basic principles, are there any principles that I've forgotten here, Daniel? Then you're off to a great start.
Exactly. No, I think you got the basics right there. Thank
Excellent. Okay. Well, let us know in the comments to this video what you thought, and if you want a follow-up maybe to look at more things. There's always more things to look at and more things to share, but it remains just for me to say thanks, Daniel, for this awesome walkthrough,
Thank you, DJ.
and we'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.